All right. Good morning or good afternoon, good evening. Hello, everyone. If you're here, I'm glad you're here. This is Dr. Patrick Locker coming back to you live again to talk about another fun current event that I think will be, let's say, useful for everyone. So, I'm trying to think about the best way to start this. So Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert and a fairly, it seems like, strong advocate for President Donald Trump, came up with a video yesterday covering what he describes to be Trump derangement syndrome. And I thought it would be useful. I don't know that I'll be perfectly correct, but this is just my first stab at trying to break down the concept a little bit. I thought it might be useful if I were to critique the concept a little and maybe even cut out some of the BS. So just bear with me. This is not going to be as scientific as some of the other videos that I've done. In fact, I will be right back because I have to get something. But don't worry, I'm not gone. Okay, we're good. So I'm back. So there's a thing that Scott Adams created called Trump derangement syndrome. And before we even begin, let me just state that this is not a pro-Trump or anti-Trump video. None of this is me espousing political beliefs or biases. I will do whatever I can to be, let's say, perfectly clear about what I believe personally, if that should come up in the course of what I'm saying here. However, my goal is not to even dip into my personal beliefs. My goal is just to talk about the concept and see if the concept is useful. Trump derangement syndrome. I like Scott Adams, just so everyone's perfectly clear up front, so there's no questions when people start commenting on this video. I like Scott Adams. I think he is a sharp guy. I don't believe that I necessarily agree with all of what he says, and you'll see this in the video. That I think it's just hard to say specifically what the man believes, because even though he's been extremely clear, I will have to say that I have to claim ignorance because I just don't pay attention to any of this stuff. But a friend of mine showed me his video and said maybe I should talk about it, so here I am. So here's the thing. So Scott Adams, in his video, I think it was episode 418 or 814, I don't remember, could be a little dyslexic here. He described what he just calls Trump derangement syndrome. And he basically stated, and not to give away anything proprietary, that Trump derangement syndrome is built on what he describes as the Charlottesville hoax, the Russia campaign hoax, and the Trump is crazy hoax. And those are the three pillars that underlie, let's say, Trump derangement syndrome. And he spends 42 minutes or so kind of explaining what the pillars are, why they're hoaxes, and then he debunks them fairly straightforwardly, according to what he states. And then he spends the last, I would say, of the 40-something minutes, he probably spends the last 20 or 25 minutes really talking about the Charlottesville hoax, to use his word, not mine, because he thinks that's the predominant problem why people have Trump derangement syndrome. They think that he's some kind of racist, white nationalist, corporate and jellyfish, no spine person, just kind of taking everyone's support. And that's why people have Trump derangement syndrome, because they sincerely believe the hoax that, Trump's a racist of some sort. And I think, I'm going to post the link to his video in my caption so you can all watch it for yourself, because again, I think he did a very, very good job of just describing and explaining his point of view. He spoke very clearly and thoughtfully. I can't criticize that for sure. However, I have a few critiques and I have a few, let's say, disagreements with his concept, Trump derangement syndrome, and the implications of calling it Trump derangement syndrome. So I have three basic problems with what Scott Adams did the other day. So the first one is just he's misusing clinical language, and that's a pretty straightforward one, but I'll explain that a little bit more later. Number two, my second problem is that he's kind of pushing a narrative that people who can't stand Donald Trump are sick. When, in my point of view as a clinical psychologist and someone who's been reading about this fear stuff for a long time, that it actually makes perfect evolutionary sense why people are reacting to Donald Trump the way they are. Actually, it makes like literally perfect sense. It's not an ambiguous thing whatsoever. And then third, my third critique is that basically he kind of wasted time. I mean, his concept is extremely straightforward, and he took what should be a 5 or 10 minute video and he turned it into a 42 or something minute video, and it's just not necessary. It's just a waste of time. We can sum it up with the three examples of the three pillars and then talk about biases and other things like that. And I think that's the main problem is he didn't really, if I were to make an overarching point about Scott Adams' video, it's that he didn't actually talk about the psychology and the other like real human concepts that really matter the most. He mentioned biases, that kind of stuff at the beginning, but he didn't even dig into it at all. And he's a smart guy, so he can clearly talk about these things. You don't have to be a doctor like me to talk about these concepts. They're available everywhere. Google Scholar, PubMed, hell, you can Wikipedia some of these things, and Wikipedia will be fairly accurate. So again, the three critiques are he's misusing clinical language, he's pushing a narrative that people are sick when I don't think that's necessarily true, and it might be maladaptive, but I don't necessarily think it's sick. And then third, I think he actually just wasted some time. Again, I'm a pragmatist, no need to waste time. And I hope to make this video very, very short and very, very painless for everyone. Well, I'll do the best that I can, at least. So the first critique is that he's just misusing clinical language. So he calls it Trump derangement syndrome. So syndrome is just a clustering of symptoms that speaks to an underlying illness, essentially. And the problem is, back to my second critique, is that I don't think it's an illness at all. I don't think that people bad mouthing the president and being nasty about him is a good thing. Like, again, this is not my political belief. So just we're perfectly clear. This is not me saying I like the president or I hate the president. That's not what I'm saying at all. However, I don't necessarily think that people bad mouthing the guy and harassing the president, I don't think that's good. I don't think that's useful. I don't think it helps anyone, even if you're just trying to get your point of view across. It doesn't work. It's not good for us. However, I don't think that means that those people are sick. So I think there's a stark difference between calling people sick and just saying that people are overreacting. I don't think overreaction necessarily equates sick, so to speak. Now, this is a huge debate in psychiatry and psychology because essentially my profession and psychiatry have been arguing for about 100 years what necessarily constitutes illness. Where is the, let's say, shades of gray line between you're having a little bit of anxiety, you're having a mild amount of anxiety, you're having a moderate amount of anxiety, you're having a severe amount of anxiety. Like, at which of those points is it an illness? And is it just because it causes functional consequences, or is it about the severity of the feeling? Is it about how long the feeling lasts, frequency, intensity, duration, etc.? That's a big debate, but that's all secondary. So again, first critique is he's just misusing clinical language, and I don't necessarily think that's accurate because of point number two, which is he's calling people sick. And it's not that I don't want to hurt people's feelings, because as you all have heard me say, I'm a little less interested in how good you feel when I say something to you. This is something I tell my patients, something I tell my students, my friends, my family, everyone. Your feelings are slightly less important than your beliefs, your attitudes, and your behavior. And if your beliefs are crap, your beliefs are crap. If your beliefs are causing negative consequences for you, that's a problem. So you can have crappy beliefs and not be sick. You can just be misinformed, ignorant, misled, etc. Or I'll explain my third point, what's really going on, I think. So I just like him calling people sick because I don't think it's accurate, and I think it's adding stigma to people who are responding like I think most animals would in this kind of circumstance. I just simply think that what he calls Trump derangement syndrome is a normal adaptation to what people perceive to be a threat. And I'll talk about that. Yeah, I'll talk about that in depth here. And again, this could all easily be explained from the perspective of evolutionary psychology and social psychology, which I'll do here in a minute. Um, he also said in his video that he has the ability to, let's say, reduce people to word salad. So he's talking about how his ability to like engage with people on Twitter, um, and let's say be so rational with them when they're being so irrational that he can reduce them to word salad because he can kind of get them to talk themselves into circles and say stupid things, which I'm sure is true. I'm sure he is so eloquent and so thoughtful that he can, let's say, take people who are in an activated state of mind and make them say stupid things because they're just not thinking clearly. In fact, they might not even be, let's say, thinking as we would all define thinking. So there's that. I just think that his, let's say, confrontational attitude is not quite as useful. He's not a mean guy by any stretch of the imagination. He's not like nasty. I think he has just a little bit of a confrontational attitude, and I don't know that that's going to help Trump derangement syndrome, so to speak. The whole reducing people to word salad thing, as much as I love a good fight because on the big five personality, I'm terribly disagreeable, like second percentile or something. I don't think that it's necessarily useful at this point. See, also in the video, he said that that our country has very poor mental health, which I couldn't agree with more. I mean, we have a mental health and an addiction crisis in this country, and everyone's struggling, it seems, with anxiety, depression, shame, low self-esteem, what have you, and people are overdosing and dying. All sorts of craziness has happened. And if you don't believe me, go check out my page on Facebook. Check out PCI Westlake Center's page on Facebook. There are stats and numbers there all the time talking about it. He blamed, though, in his video, Scott Adams blamed the poor mental health of the country on the press's reaction to the president. And this I fairly strongly disagree with because it always takes two to tango. And you all know, if you've watched any of my videos, so please, if you've never watched any of my videos before and this is your first one, go watch a couple of them. Because in at least one of them, you'll hear me say, I abhor the press. I think the press have become this gross, defunct thing. They're like a nasty growth on the side of your leg that you wish to cut off. I think they are terribly, terribly gross. So we're all perfectly clear. I abhor the press. I think our press is sick and will eventually die. I think that group of people is sick for sure. And it's sad because we've eaten ourselves alive due to what I will explain in my third point. However, I think it's fair to say that it's not just the press's fault. I know the press is not helping by any stretch of the imagination, and I do not wish them to do, let's say, good business anymore. I wish for them to not succeed. However, the president says, and again, like him or dislike him, he says things that are incendiary. And I can't know because I don't live in Donald Trump's head, and I'm not going to assume because that's unfair and just not respectful. My gut instinct about the man is that he probably is aware that he's saying incendiary things. I don't believe for a second that our president is stupid or anything of that nature. I definitely agree with Scott Adams when Scott says in multiple interviews that our president is very savvy. He knows how to read a room, and he knows how to, in my opinion, poke the bear if need be. Now, would I, let's say, logistically agree with the president poking the bear, with poking people on Twitter and whatnot? Maybe not. However, I don't think he's stupid, and I don't think that he's just some helpless victim to the press. It's like walking into a boxing ring with Mike Tyson and being upset that Mike Tyson is beating the crap out of you. No, you chose to walk into the boxing ring. That's a choice that you intentionally made. So you can't complain at all, in my opinion. I think if you're continuing to poke them, continuing to tell like Mike Tyson his face tattoo is stupid, he's going to keep punching you in the face. And that's how it works. Right? And God, I hope Mike Tyson doesn't come after me for saying that as an example. But who knows? Maybe a lawsuit would be good for me. Who knows? Whatever. Anyways, I disagree with Scott Adams' point that the poor mental health of the country is just because of the press. I sincerely believe the press is not helping at all, essentially. However, I don't think it's just their fault. I think the fault in terms of, let's say, the incendiary comments back and forth is two-part. It's the press and it's the president. And the other politicians aren't helping at all. People like Pelosi say stupid things. People like AOC say ridiculously stupid things. People like McConnell don't necessarily speak very thoughtfully and sometimes say stupid things. Um, uh, all of them, left and right, left and right. I don't pay attention. So I don't know. I'm not biased towards conservatives. I just don't freaking know because I don't pay attention. But some of the glaring errors on the left are easier to see. So again, to summarize how and why we're sick and possibly struggling with a bias, let's recall a great quote, back to my third point, kind of the evolutionary psychology and the social psych point of view, which is just shorter and simpler, and you don't need 42 minutes for. Let's start off by explaining this with a quote from our dearly departed friend, Christopher Hitchens, whom I miss greatly, and I think the world is at a serious loss for him not being here whatsoever, because he provided something very useful for the debate on rationality and how to really have a thoughtful discussion about very serious, important issues across the world. So I miss him, and wherever he is, I miss him. So Christopher Hitchens once said, "Evolution has meant that our prefrontal lobes are too small, our adrenal glands are too big, and our reproductive organs, apparently designed by a committee," which is weird, "a recipe which, alone or in combination, is very certain to lead to some unhappiness and disorder." So he says, because of how we're built neurologically and physiologically, we're kind of stupid Neanderthals still because of how we've evolved to survive, so to speak. And this is actually true. In fact, there's an article that came out by Professor Ronnie Paz of the Weizmann Institute of Science, and it basically shows that because our brains are built in a certain way and how they've, let's say, evolved over time, human beings are just much more likely, like way more likely, to suffer from any kind of mental illness like anxiety, PTSD, because we don't have a brain that's well designed for the here and now challenges of Twitter and pornography and all these different things that are immediate gratification and activate our threat and survival instincts all day long. We don't have a brain that's well designed for that. And that's what Professor Paz's article shows, which I'll post in the caption here. So how would I not waste time like Scott Adams? So here's how I would be very, very, let's say, brief and to the point. The first thing I would say is, if you really want to save time, just go to Amazon or mascotbooks.com and get my book. It's very short. I have no problem with the fact that this is a shameless plug because it makes perfect sense. So get the book, read about the fear problem, read about how our fear system is organized, and you'll be, let's say, kind of like, oh yeah, that's why I act this way. I guarantee you will. I guarantee it, or I will buy your book back from you on national television or national YouTube, whatever this is. So how would I explain why we're, let's say, engaging in what Scott Adams calls Trump derangement syndrome? I don't think it's a syndrome. I think it's a natural adaptation to an evolutionary threat. So why is Donald Trump, theoretically speaking, a threat to the people on the left and the people who can't stand him and globalists or whoever else can't stand the guy? Well, there are lots of very specific reasons, like trade or he said this one hateful sounding thing or whatever it is, which Scott Adams had all sorts of good rebuttals for. So I'm not going there. I'm going to speak about how your brain is built and how your instincts work. So he referenced biases, and it's real simple. We have a grouping problem, which is we have a tribalism problem, which people have been talking about for a couple of years now, which is good. We need to get the concept out there more. So because of our tribalistic instincts, which I could explain at length, but there's no time for that here, we are more likely to engage in fallacies and biases whenever we take in information from the outside world about people who do not look, sound, or think like us. This is something we have evolved over thousands of years to not die, because we need our tribe to not die. And if we're different than our tribe, we die. We get ousted from the tribe and we possibly die. So we have tribalistic instincts, basically speaking. I know I'm overgeneralizing, but just stick with me. We have these tribalistic instincts that make us engage in biases and fear-based aggressive behavior. And I talk about proactive aggression and reactive aggression in my book. So get the book. So let's talk about the basic biases that we're all engaging in and how you can do something different about them. And in fact, I did a video on biases like a year ago. So go check out that video for sure. And I also talked about adaptive group identification about 6 months ago. So go check out those videos. So the 5 main biases, I think, or 4 maybe, are the confirmation bias, the anchoring bias, the actor-observer bias, the false consensus effect, and maybe the availability heuristic. And he also mentions cognitive dissonance at the end, so I'll touch on that. So confirmation bias is basically you have a bias for good or bad reason, for evolutionary reasons or because you're stupid, or both. And you keep seeking out information that confirms what you already believe to be true. So the easy example would be, and again, this does not reflect my political beliefs, so just stick with me. The average person who cannot stand Donald Trump probably watches CNN, MSNBC, or other, let's say, pundits on YouTube or podcasts that are basically anti-Trump. So because of confirmation bias, they pretty much only watch information that's negative, which probably is kind of activating other biases. And I'll talk about it later, like the false consensus effect. So because of confirmation bias, you only get one side of the story, which means that your viewpoint is basically wrong. It might not be perfectly wrong. It might be 50% wrong. It might be 30% wrong. It might be 70% wrong. You can't know that, though, because you're only looking at one side of the spectrum. So you're making yourself stupid by acting on your confirmation bias. So don't be stupid is the solution to that. Listen to stuff that you don't like listening to. The second bias is the anchoring bias. And this one is, I'd say, equally as important. So when you're watching a news article or you're reading something on Twitter or you're listening to my video, you probably heard a phrase or a thing at the beginning that made you think one thing or the other. And then that thing that you heard or read will, let's say, shape the way you see the rest of what I say. So we call that the anchoring bias. It's the first thing you hear shapes the rest of what you're hearing or seeing, etc. So if there's an incendiary headline, like the New York Times or CNN or Fox News or InfoWars or whatever, that incendiary headline will activate your anchoring bias. And even if there is some bit of truth in it, that headline might have shaded how you see the truth because that's how we're built. So hopefully that's clear for everyone. The third bias is the actor-observer bias. So basically, this is when we, let's say, attribute bad behavior to someone's personal flaws, not necessarily to circumstances. So there are 2 things that basically influence the way we act. Our personal, like how we're built, our personality, our motivation, our intelligence, etc., and the circumstance. And it's always 2. It's always a marriage of both, the context and who we are. So the actor-observer bias is that when we watch someone do a bad thing, we tend to, generally speaking, believe that because of that person's characterological flaws, they acted that way. Or because of their characterological strengths, they did that good thing, right? So that's the actor-observer bias. And the easy example is if you don't like the president, let's say you're one of these people who calls Donald Trump Cheeto Man, and you really mean it because you can't stand the guy. You probably are more likely to see him do something, say something, and because of the other biases I mentioned, you might think it's a bad thing. And you're going to say that the bad thing that he did is because he's a bad person. His personality, he's a narcissist, he's whatever, right? You can say all sorts of bad things about the president and be wrong, or possibly right, depending upon the circumstance, and be attributing it to just his character, when in reality there might be a context problem. And Scott Adams came up with the example in his talk of how someone interviewed the president, I think it was Jake Tapper or someone, about Charlottesville, and he took a second to respond, as opposed to just outright reactively saying, no, whatever his name is, the David Duke is a bad person. He flat out basically said, it was about David Duke. He flat out said, well, he stuttered, or he didn't say anything, and then he said something. So it's like they attributed that actor-observer bias. They attributed that to his personality or his beliefs, when in reality, he might have just been responding to an anxiety about being caught off guard, right? So that's the actor-observer bias, number 3. Number 4 is the false consensus effect. So again, this goes back to the anchoring bias and the confirmation bias. If you're only saying negative headlines, and if you really can't stand Donald Trump, then all you're going to do is start to believe that everyone thinks just like CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, Washington Post, whatever. Because a lot of these major sources and a number of these major sources can't stand the president and always ridicule him or criticize him, then all you're going to do, because of the false consensus effect, is think that the vast majority of people cannot stand what the president's doing. When in reality, and that same goes for polls too, polling data can work the same way. The problem is there are lots of people who like him. Like Ricky Rebel just came out on the red carpet at the Grammys and said, I'm one of the 60-something million Americans who voted for Trump and who loved Donald Trump, right? So there's a decent swath of the country who really likes the president and really thinks what he's doing is great. But we don't hear about it because the major news organizations apparently are kind of biased. And so that gives us the false consensus effect that everyone thinks that what he's doing is bad, right? So hopefully that makes sense to everyone. And then we have what's called the availability heuristic. So whatever seems most frequent must be true, right? So for example, with the president, with so much negative press coverage, he must be a bad guy. There must be something characterologically bad about him. He must be in bed with all sorts of bad people, etc. He must be a bad guy, right? And then again, at the end, Scott Adams mentioned cognitive dissonance and how basically what the research shows, and you can all fact check me on this, is that when we have cognitive dissonance, it's actually much easier to go back to our previous position as opposed to changing our mind because the anxiety or dissonance is too uncomfortable. So oftentimes we have to power through that cognitive dissonance, that anxiety, that, let's say, irritability, and feel like uncomfortable as we start to consider new information. So we typically fall back to our old point of view. So whenever you hear a new fact about the president that actually makes him look good, you might have cognitive dissonance if you don't like the guy. So your goal is to overcome that cognitive dissonance and possibly see the shades of gray as who the person is, right? It's impossible for him to be all bad. I'm sorry. Whether or not you like the president, it doesn't matter to me. It is impossible for him to be all bad. Same goes with Clinton. Same goes with Obama or anyone else. Like, it is just impossible for them to be all bad. They would have died if they were all gross. They're not. They might be really bad in your point of view, but it's impossible for them to be all bad. So you have to see the shades of gray of a person. And cognitive dissonance makes it hard to do that. It makes it easier to, let's say, reject facts that exist in the universe. And as I pointed out in the book, because of our tribalistic instinct and the fact that we don't think very clearly when our fear system is overengaged because we perceive a legitimate threat, or we've taken a non-legitimate threat and it's been turned into a legitimate threat because of these biases I just talked about. These biases I just talked about can make you so afraid, activate your fear system so much that you don't actually see the facts accurately. People that I respect and appreciate, like Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson and all sorts of people, have said things that I think speak to their tribalistic instincts on religion, on the president, on all sorts of things, which is sad because I think these people are brilliant and wonderful. Dave Rubin and the Weinstein brothers and all of them. I think they're very brilliant people. I think because we're human and we have these biases that are alive and well, and we have this fear system that we think we understand, but we don't understand. We actually say things that are either not true or are very, very biased, I think. So I think we need to have a second look at our biases about the president. I think Trump derangement syndrome is not the best way of looking at people who can't stand the man. I think that's an unfair assessment of things. I think it's pithy, and I think it keeps Scott Adams' popularity alive for sure. I don't necessarily, and I'm not denigrating Scott because, again, like I said at the beginning, I like the guy. I really do. I like what he's done, and I'm very grateful for Dilbert because it was a big part of my childhood. My mom and my dad liked Dilbert. They thought it was funny, corporate America, all sorts of good stuff, right? It's just that I think this particular concept of his doesn't serve us. That's all. I would just explain it in terms of the 5 biases that I discussed earlier, plus cognitive dissonance, plus our fear system, that we think we understand, but we don't actually understand instinctually. Because as Robert Wright said in his book, Why Buddhism is True, um, our consciousness, what we think we're doing and how we think we're in charge, is really like a good PR company. When in reality, there are all these evolutionary instinctual modules that are in charge under the, let's say, behind the curtain, that actually make us act. And one of those instinctual modules is our fear system, as Jaak Panksepp would describe it. Our panic and grief and our fear system and our seeking system, according to Panksepp, are probably the biggest instinctual modules that are in charge. And our consciousness is like 20%, 30% in charge if we're lucky. So we have this fear problem, this fear instinct that's making us, think Cheeto Man's bad, essentially. And that may be true, that may not be true, but I don't think most of you have a very accurate understanding of how your instincts are getting in the way of your ability to see things accurately, thanks to these biases and thanks to the fear system being overactive. So, I'll leave you with those thoughts, and I would love to know what you all think. One final note about Scott Adams. There's a couple of people who are commenting on Scott Adams' Twitter yesterday, and they were calling him an antibiotic for Trump derangement syndrome. And then one person, I can't remember which user it was, one person said that Scott Adams is doing a good job, but that Trump derangement syndrome is antibiotics resistant. And I think that's perfectly true. I think we have, if you were to use the concept of Trump derangement syndrome, it's antibiotics resistant because we have this, let's say, evolutionary instinct that is not prone to antibiotics. It can't work. It's impossible to tell someone your fear of dying is not well founded. And if you don't believe me, try talking to someone with a phobia about spiders or heights or whatever. Try telling those people that their fear is unfounded and just tell them to stop it. Stop being afraid. See how well it works for you. It's not going to work because, again, our fear system is about not dying, right? That's all it's about. It's about approach, avoid, so we don't die. So if our fear system is hijacked and then we're using these 5 biases and there's a cognitive dissonance problem and we're kind of acting on our tribalistic instincts and all that good stuff like I talk about in my book, get the book. It's real cheap on Amazon. Maybe we're not seeing the president very accurately. Or maybe we love the president because he's activating that other half of our fear instinct, which is love the people in our group so that we don't die. Because if we love the people in our group, then they keep us and respect us and hold us. So it's very, very important, in my opinion, to understand on which side of the spectrum do you lie. Are you very, very anti the president? And is it because of these biases I've just discussed here and your fear system and your tribalism kind of instinct being hijacked? Or is it because you love the guy because, of your tribalistic instincts and these biases that you have? Either direction, if you are at the tail end, if you're 3 standard deviations out for liking the president or 3 standard deviations out for hating the guy, you're clearly not doing well. In fact, you're responding in a way that makes sense, but it's not adaptive for you. That's all. So it's not a judgment. Your biases are just making you stupid. You don't need to be stupid. That's all. So this is my critique of Scott Adams. I hope it makes perfect sense. I try to keep it shorter than his video. Hopefully I achieved that too. I appreciate you all for watching. I appreciate you all for commenting. Trump derangement bias, as Bobby says. So Bobby Snickers says, best PR company right here, boo. Perfect. He's right. So again, this is my thought. Scott Adams, love him, smart guy, nice guy, decent guy, it seems like, but I think his concept is hurting people. I think it's creating more divisiveness unnecessarily. So I propose that we just talk about it technically, and then we work in a technical way on the biases and things like that that are keeping us from being rational and reasonable with each other. And it's not an easy thing because we have this very, very overly sensitive fear system, which I talk about in the book. So I hope this all makes sense. I look forward to any and all comments. And by now, Hopefully, you still don't know what I think about the president. I hope I did a good job. Anyways, have a great day. Hope this doesn't get me fired. And I'll see you probably in a week. Maybe not. Who knows?